So today we start the basics of watercolor painting. So in the PowerPoint, I have a list of supplies you'll need, and if you got your kit from school, hopefully you did, you've got a paint set like this, you've got a brush in here, kind of a detail brush, and you've got a couple of these, a really small one and a larger one, so you have 3 total. You've got a mixing palette. You actually have 2 because I put one in here, and you can also use the lid. We use this one more in class because when it's time to go at the end and we got to clean up kind of quickly, this one it's easier to not use this. That way you can just kind of do this one, rinse it, dry it, and you're ready to go. Watercolor paper. This paper will be available in the office. It is 15 inches wide and 11 inches tall, and we're going to divide that in just a minute for some samples. If you want to get some pretty good paper, it's one of the few things I think that you can get locally. I got this at Walmart. This is what it looks like. When I got it, which is about a year or so ago, it was about $6. It's really good paper for what you can get here, so it's a surprisingly good value. But you can always use this, what we have from school. You'll need a roll of masking tape and just a regular pencil. You'll need some paper towels, napkins, something to use with the water. You'll also need a cup of water. So what I use is just a cup like this that I fill up. I just keep these in class. If you're in class and you happen to have any of these, if you would, just run them through the dishwasher and bring them in, because these after a while get kind of cracked and a little bit dirty, and I like to replace them when I can. And I can eat only so much yogurt, so I always look for help. Table salt, so any kind of salt will do, just the cheapest that you can buy. Just have a little bit handy. I keep it in one of these. This is an old Tic Tac container. Makes it kind of handy. You also need some rubbing alcohol. This happens to be 50% because it's all I could get when the coronavirus hit and all the supplies were gone. But it's better to use a 70 or the 94%. The stronger rubbing alcohol does a better effect with the paint. And with the rubbing alcohol, I'm going to keep it in here so it's a little easier to use. And then just a scrap board. This is just an old piece of kind of like plywood. For this example, I'm going to show you how to tape this down. A piece of cardboard will work okay. When I get to the actual samples, I want to do mine one at a time, and I want to use this as my board because that way I can zoom in and show you the samples a little better. But check that list. It's the second slide on the PowerPoint, and it tells you what you need, and whether it's school or things you need to get at home, so that you're ready to go. So there's a slide that shows you all those supplies together. And the next slide is a list of techniques that we'll be practicing. I put a little note on there that this video you're watching right now is the main source of information, but I'm going to put some examples on the PowerPoint as we go from this video so that you have some of those still shots you can look at in addition to pausing this as you go. So the first thing we want to do is to divide this off, because we're going to want, in the end, when it's all said and done, you want it to look like this with all your samples. And so we've got to tape it certain places, and what that entails is just measuring it off. So if you'll take a ruler and starting at 0 up at the top, just put a little mark every 3 inches. And then do the same thing at the bottom. You don't have to draw a line, because what you're going to do is take the tape, and if you look through the tape, just kind of center that little dot. So my little dot is right there. Kind of center it on the tape. Then if you do the same thing at the bottom, you know that it's straight. So it's a quick way to get the tape straight. That will give you some good edges. We're going to talk about masking as one of the techniques. So what you're doing now is masking. You're just using it to create the page. If you've got a little extra money, you can get this same width in something like painter's tape, or the frog tape. The green tape is really good to use. But regular old masking tape works just fine. Sometimes though you have to be a little careful whenever you take it off so that it doesn't rip the page. So these are slightly smaller than 3 inches because the tape takes up a little bit of space. Now when you measure the other direction, you got to know a little bit about your measurements here, because you're going to start this way now and go from 0 to 3 5/8. So if you're not sure about rulers, there are 8 little spaces in here. So what you want to do is to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, however it's marked on your ruler. And on the left edge, do 3 5/8, and then 3 5/8. Then start on the right hand side from the very top, 3 5/8, and then 3 5/8. And that allows you to tape in this direction. Doing the same thing, just centering that little dot, that little mark. Mine's a little off center, so I just pick it up, reposition it. And if you want, you can tape around the edges. I think I'm going to, so that, because when you put water on a page, it's going to buckle up a little bit. And watercolor paper is heavier, and it's designed to take that water, and it doesn't quite as much, but it still has to be taped. If you really get into watercolor painting, what you do is you stretch the paper. It's kind of like stretching a drum head, in that you can soak it, completely soak it underwater for about 10 minutes, and then when the water expands it, you either tape, or you can take a staple gun and staple it to a thicker board, and you've got the paper hooked down. When it dries, it shrinks and it stretches, so it'll stay completely flat the whole time. So we really don't get into that, but for this paper, it wouldn't stretch well because it's got a coating on it that's made to work without the stretching. Another thing this will do is it's going to leave you some white spaces in between later on to label. So sometimes I'll write things as I go on the tape. Just remember, the tape's going to be gone. We're going to go back and label all these as we go. So as I go, I want to go in this order. From the top of the list, this will be Graffito and scratching out, glazing, stamping, flat wash, and graded wash. Then I'll go across here, and I'll end up with the last one, which is dry brush. So if you want to follow that order, that will be, I think, a good thing to do. And I mention that because I'm going to switch from this board to some smaller sheets, and I'm going to use an individual sheet for each one of these so that I can show you closer. The first one is Graffito, and this is an Italian word that translates scratching or to scratch. And there's different applications of it, but we're going to use it to kind of create some effects beforehand on the paper before you paint, and pretty cool effect. You can do this with a lot of different media. I'm also going to divide it in half, because on the other half I'm going to do scratching out, which is something where you'll have to paint it and then come back when it's dry, come back to it a little bit later. So for Scrafita, what we have to do is scratch into the paper. You can use an X-Acto knife, just the tip of a knife. What I'm going to use is a tool that's made for scratch board, something like this. A needle or a pen will work just fine. Also, if you have a mechanical pencil, just push the lead in. You can kind of use it sort of on the side. Anything that will kind of dig a little groove into the paper. And so what I'm doing is, you can't really see it. I can barely see it with the angle that I've turned it. But you're creating these little bitty grooves. It's like digging little ditches into the paper. And when you put the paint on in the water, what will happen is the paint will settle down in there. It's also scratching down to some bare paper. It's getting past just the coating. And exposing it. Now I'm set up here a little bit close because I want to be close on the illustration, but also kind of show you as much as I can. I've got my water right up here and palette here. Now with the paint set, I try to use mostly the primary colors. So although you've got them all, the red, yellow, and blue are the ones I'm going to use the most. If you'll notice, black in this set is brand new. I hadn't even touched it. The brown is, I've used it a tiny bit. Sometimes I'll come in and put some violet or some orange, but I'll always put it with something else. I've very, very rarely used the green, violet, and orange just on their own, because colors will look better, they'll look more sophisticated, more artistic if you mix them yourself. And from the colored pencils, you know how to do that. So you'll see me mix some colors on here to show you kind of how to transfer the idea of mixing colors with colored pencils into paint. So let's say if I wanted brown. Okay, I could go with the brown on the set, but I know that to mix brown, I need yellow, red, and blue. So I put some pure water, just clear water in here, and then I put some water on the paint. And as long as you have paint around the edge, no matter if the bottom is showing, as long as there's some paint around the edge, you've got paint. And I'm activating the paint. And then I want to take this to put into the palette and sort of scrape it off on the side. That's the easiest way, because sometimes people will just kind of move it back and forth. If you scrape it off on the side, that'll get it in there a little better. And I know that I'm going to cover a fairly big area, so I want a few brushfuls of that. And I'm starting with yellow because that's my lightest color. And then I'll move on as I'm mixing it. Mixing a little red. So it kind of becomes this red-orange. It's almost brown there. I'm cleaning my brush between each time so I don't get a color I don't want mixed in. Then we'll try just a little bit of blue. What that does is it takes the orange and makes it sort of an orangey brown. And I think I'm going to add just a little bit more. Not much. See what that does. Yeah, that looks good. And if I'm covering a bigger area, I want to switch to a bigger brush. So I'm getting this biggest one out. This is called a Mop Brush. Kind of looks like a little mop. Now usually what I'll do is I'll wet it down, then I'll pull the water out so it's damp. Now remember, I've dug grooves in that with one of several tools. Then when you pull the paint across it, it's really best to not scrub it too much. Just pull it across and leave it. Then the lines start to show up. It'll sit on the top, and all the color and water sort of pours down into those little tiny channels that you've dug. It'll be a little rough. It'll kind of have some picks from the paper. One example you can do is what I did here. It kind of gives it a wood grain look. So if you had something close up that was like an old board or something, that's one good effect you can do with Scrafito. And we'll just let that dry. Now on the other side, where it says on the list, scratching out color, on that one, I'm just going to add some red to what I've already got. So I'll go with a kind of a dulled down red. And I want it to be thick paint. when you're using watercolor, this is what I mean by thick paint. It's still going to be watery. Thick just means that you've got a lot of color to your water. So there's a lot of pigment in there. And what I want to do is just coat that whole area. And I'm going to let it dry. And once that's dry, a little bit later on, I'll come back to that and I'll show you some of the scratching out. The next one is glazes, and this is really thin layers of paint. It's one way that you can mix colors on the page and get a real flat color, but it takes a little time because you have to let layers dry. So I've cleaned out my water because I want to keep my colors really pure. And on this one, unlike most of them, it's important that you use clean versions of the primaries, and I'm not going to let them touch so they won't blend. So what we're going to want is in your palette, in an area that's clean, you're going to put some water, and I like to start with the yellow since it's the lightest of the three. And this is not going to be a very thick paint, which means there's a little more water than paint. So what I want to do is just start on one edge and paint a stripe. It's about a third or so, maybe a little less, the way across. Then I want to rinse that brush out well. And now I'm going to go into a pure red. So I've got some water right here I'll use. I was going to use this one, but some yellow flowed over into it, so I'll need to move over here. And again, you don't want it too thin, but these are going to be layers that you'll see through. Now leave a little dry paper so these won't run together. Just leave a little strip of dry paper, maybe a little more color. There we go. And paint you a strip of red, and we'll do the same thing with blue. Clean that brush out. And so I got to find a place in my palette. If you run out of places to mix, you can just take it over and rinse it right out in any sink, and you're good to go. So a little bit of space. And I'm not taping these all the way down just so it's a little easier for me to switch and the video doesn't get too long, but you won't have this problem, which is nice. So you can see that those are kind of watery, but I'm just going to let those dry, and when we come back to do the scratching out, we can also do the glazes. With stamping, most of what we'll do is later on, so all I did here was just thicken up. I used a lot of what I had left, and if you'll just coat this with paint. I put several of these that needed to dry a little while first so that they can be drying while we're doing other things, and we can get back to them a little easier. So just coat it, and we'll let it sit. Notice on these examples I'm coating the whole surface. We're going to talk about leaving white areas a little bit later on. The washes are designed to get a smooth paint. Imagine one of the most useful things for it is if you did a sky, like in a landscape. And the difference between the flat wash and graded is the flat wash will not change value. It will not get lighter or darker, but the graded wash does. So they're exactly the same except for one step. And I'll show you that in just a minute. And I went ahead and taped this. I taped it vertically, so on this one it kind of matters. Make it look a little more like the ones you have on your page. And also I needed to tape it all the way around so that it doesn't bow up. So that's what you've already got on yours. Now what I'm going to do, if you can see, is I want to tilt it. So when I'm working, I have the bottom resting on the table, and the top, you can either put something under it or just kind of hold it up a couple of inches. So it's tilted just a little bit. If you don't have it tilted enough, you'll notice that the bead of water I'm about to show you won't happen. If you have it tilted too much, it'll run down the page. So that's a good way to judge if you've got it tilted enough. I have a lot because I'm going to cover a lot of area, and you can't stop while you're doing this. Time is really important. So before you get going, you have to have a lot of good thick paint mixed up. So a lot of color, a lot of water, and I'm hoping that will be enough because my sample is about twice as big as yours. So what I'm going to do is I'll take a brush, I'm going to dip it in, and you'll see me pull it across here, and it'll bead up on the bottom. And I'm telling you this before I start because you don't want to let it sit, or if it dries for just a few seconds too long, it'll get a line across there. What you're trying to do is just to pull that water, that colored water, which is all watercolor paint is, down the page. So you get the color sticking to the page, and you get that bead of water. The next brush stroke, you just barely go into that bead of water, and each time between this I'm going back and filling my brush up. So you just go across, pull that water down, it'll kind of suck it down to the next level. If you get a little sprinkle like I did there, as long as you get to it pretty quickly, it should be okay. Key is dip your brush back into the paint every single time. So I'm a little too tilted, it was about to run. If you get a little spot you miss, you can usually go back real quick and touch it up. But if you have everything ready at the very first, then you won't see any brush strokes. And at the very end, down at that bottom on the tape, whatever of this water that I'm pulling down each time is left, you can just take a paper towel and pull that off and just let that dry. And now I'll show you the difference between the same value all the way down and one that gets lighter as it goes down. Okay, graded wash. Same thing, I've got a lot of thick paint. I went with kind of a red violet this time just for something different. And the difference is, what's going to happen is I'm going to start the same way. So right now, off camera, I'm dipping in the paint. I've got my paper tilted. Notice it's looking just like a flat wash. So everything's the same so far. I'm dipping in the paint every time I do a brush stroke. And I'll let that go down, maybe about that far. Now what I'm going to start to do is instead dip my brush in the water. So now, instead of dipping in the paint, I'm just dipping it in the water. And so every time you go across there, it waters down the paint just a little bit more. And little by little, it just runs out of paint. So the technique's the same, you're just not adding any more paint. And by the time you get down to the bottom, it should just be pretty much clear water. And you have to finish it though, you'll get that line. So I'm about to get a drip. Oops, there it goes. So graded just has to do with the gradation. It's gradating from dark to light. Everything else is exactly the same as a flat wash. Wet and wet is exactly what it sounds like, is that you're going to work on a wet paper. So what I've done, I've already wet down the bottom from these marks down so it can be sitting for a minute, because if you heard people say I'm just sitting around watching paint dry, it's a little bit of what we're doing this time. So from there up, you can see I've just wet it. Now the reason I want to show you that is because it'll behave differently depending on how much paint, how thick your paint is in the brush when you add it, and also how wet the paper is. It's pretty dry over here, so you can see that it really doesn't do a whole lot. So that's really not wet and wet. When you get over here into where it is wet, you see how it starts to kind of fuzz out. It diffuses out into that water, and it gets an edge that you can't really get any other way. Now on the part I just wet, notice how quick it happens. So the wetter the paper, the more it's going to diffuse. So if you do a few of these kind of as a test, and kind of see what effect you want. Then you can kind of get an idea of how long to let it dry. The next one is called mixing color. We're going to do that on a dry paper, but you can also do that with your wet and wet. So if I wanted orange, I can mix in a yellow on top of that red, and it's going to start to create that orange. So you still kind of see your original colors, but that's an effect there's no way you can get just pulling with the orange out of the set. So wet and wet's kind of fun. You can also let that dry and put more water on an area, work back into it. The room's pretty hot this morning, so it's drying pretty quickly. This down here, still wet enough, but you can see down the bottom, it happens a lot slower. And some of the beauty of this, and we'll talk about it in future videos when we start to actually use these techniques in artwork. That area is dried out, so it's not a good example either. Watercolor is a lot about telling the watercolor paint, I want you to do this effect in this area, but you have to give it room to do its own thing. And that's kind of what it's doing here. So sort of closely related to the wet and wet is mixing color on the paper. So on this one the paper is dry, so it is a big difference, but you notice we mixed the color last time, only the edges kind of got really soft. What you can do if you start with a dry paper is, if you want to mix a color, we could put down, let's say, a lot of yellow. Let's say I want some green. I want maybe some shrubbery or something, some kind of ground stuff. So I could paint kind of the shape of some trees, maybe off in the distance, and then if I went in with the blue, I want to get those soft edges, but it'll stop right where I put the yellow. It won't go anywhere past that. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds. You can control where it is a little more. And it's just going to start, right now it just sort of looks like blue and yellow, but as it begins to blend, maybe add some yellow back into it, kind of re-wetting it. This is also a technique I didn't put on the list called charging. When it's wet and you put more color back into it, you can kind of charge it up. And it's a very loose kind of feel, which is more like what watercolors are intended to be. So it's not like you've painted every branch and every leaf. You're just kind of suggesting it. Then if you need some truer green, some ones that look like it, there's nothing that says you can't go into the pre-mixed green in the set and add just a little bit. Kind of enhance certain areas. But overall, I don't like to use the pre-mix too much. I'll use it only kind of in addition to things that I've created. So wet and wet on the inside, but it's a harder edge on the outside. Salt is a special effect, and you want to use it kind of sparingly, and when you put it in a certain area, you don't want to put the salt everywhere. But I'm using a thick paint, so it's plenty watery, but I've got a lot of paint on there too. And then I'm going to take a little just regular table salt. What I do is put a little out in my hand, take a little pinch of salt, and I just sort of twist my fingers as I drop it in. Again, leave some places where no salt touches, and don't get too much salt in any area. And you'll see an effect right off the bat. What's happening is the salt is soaking up the water, which means it's soaking up the color. Time for the next class. And I wish I had taped that all the way around since it's so wet, but I'll do a kind of an emergency tape, maybe. And this is one that you have to let dry like that, and we'll come back and look at it a little later. In about 10 or 15 minutes, that'll have a whole different look. Rubbing alcohol is another special effect, and it also needs a coating of thick paint. And again, the stronger the rubbing alcohol, the better. I'm keeping it in this little jar here for class, but you can also just clean out an old lid from a soda, put a little bit in there, and you can put it on a lot of ways. One way is the brush. You can control it a lot better. Just make sure your brush is clean before and that you wash it with soap after, so you get all the rubbing alcohol out. But it does the opposite of salt. Instead of pulling the water in, it's going to repel the water. It's a pretty cool effect. Remember, we're going to start talking about keeping the white of the paper. You're never going to get back to pure white if you paint it, but you can get kind of close. One effect is like lightning. It's really hard otherwise to do this. There's a lot of uses for this. So you have to put the paint on, again, thick paint, and I usually let it sit just a little bit, and then I'll go into it. You don't have to let it sit too long. You don't want to, because the longer it sits, the less the alcohol will work on it. Okay, you probably noticed that this one is on a different board, because with the plastic wrap, I'm going to want to weight it down a little bit and let it sit. And this way I can move this board off and go back to the one I was using. So it's the last of these three special effects. It's going to have another thick paint to it. You want it to be kind of a thick paint, but you also need a lot of water on there, so it's important how you mix the paint. Now the key to this, if you put it down just flat, it's not going to do anything. What you have to do is wad it up, but notice I'm not just squishing it down. I'm just sort of making this kind of a puffy thing, like that. Then what I want to do is to set it on there. Then just take something, the salt container, like that will work, that weights it down, but not too much. So you kind of have that going on. And let it sit there until it dries. Just to be safe, I would give it a couple of hours. So you might want to do this one right before you're done. That way it can sit and you've already got everything else finished. Masking is just covering up places that you don't want the paper to get paint on it. So I mask around the edge. We've been doing that. You can also mask, you can tear the tape if you want it irregular, like maybe a row of trees. If you want to use what you know about two-point perspective, you could mask off maybe some buildings in the distance. You can also use just an old scrap piece of paper or a post-it note. Those always work really well to mask off large areas. A little more expensive solution would be something called Maskoid or Frisket, and what that is you paint it on. It's like rubber, like you'd make a mask with, a Halloween mask, and you let it dry, then you paint over it, and it works just like the masking tape, only you can do a lot of stuff with it. As far as curves and lines, kind of like the flexibility you had with the alcohol. So I could come back here. I'm not doing a wash, but I could do a wash back here. I could mix colors if I want to make some kind of a sunset. So the large areas, I'm not sure what that was, but I kind of like it, so I'm going to leave it. Also, if you're doing smaller techniques, like we're going to look at some stippling and things in just a minute, you might want to be able to do this and create a rough texture, but not getting at a certain area. So I'm going to leave all this so it can dry, and we'll come back and kind of take a tour of some of these that needed some drying time. So I want to show you these two together, even though they're separate on your sheet, because they're very closely related. So you want thick paint sitting by, and you want your largest brush clean and dry, where it kind of fluffs out like that. And find an old toothbrush. If you have one of those, that'd be great, because this is going to make a spattering tool. You can do it with the brush. It gets bigger spatters, different look. But I really like the look of the toothbrush. One of those highly specialized, super expensive art tools. I want to mask off the pulling up because I don't want to get that yet. What you do with spattering is you have to have enough color in it. Sometimes I even go into the palette or to the paint set and add a little color. And all I'm doing is just dipping the toothbrush in it, then I'll shake it off a little bit so there's not got too much in there. So it's loaded up with paint, but it's not drippy. And then when you pull your thumb back, it's going to go this direction. And you can get a really fine mist with it. You can kind of tell the direction sometimes. If you want a darker area, you can concentrate it. You can also use the idea of masking. Block off an area. This works for a lot of these techniques. You can kind of blend them, mix and match. So now I've got that area. So for pulling up, again, you have this brush handy. It's going to start the exact same way that spattering did. Get the paint on there, and usually I'll let it sit for just a few seconds because you want it to sort of hook to the paper but not dry. And this effect, there's a lot of things you can do with it. One thing you can think about, if you were doing a large field kind of off in the distance a little bit and you want to show that it had some tall grass in it or weeds, obviously you're not going to want to paint every single weed, but if you take this brush, this larger dried off one, and once those little dots have sat there, the dots will kind of stay. But you can begin to kind of raise some of these. And you could layer this. You could do a layer of this in yellow, put a little bit of blue, kind of get different effects. So it kind of looks flat that way, but you could do all kinds of layers. And it gets the look of field and kind of just clutter and little rocks. So spattering, you leave it alone. Pulling up, you have that one extra step. The lifting off paint can be used for a lot of things. I want to demonstrate it with making clouds because that's kind of a common thing with it. And all this time I've been working, whenever I needed a specific color, like I've changed to blue for the sky, I would go back and change my water out. So I've been pausing so that I can do that. So keeping clean water is important because that's basically half of your paint is the water that you add. So what I want to do is I want to create a wash. I'm set up with my thick paint. I want to tilt it a little bit, create a little wash. For demonstrations, I made the mountains. Actually, I'm going to move those down a little bit so I've got more sky. So if I had mountains down here, oops. And over on the side, I've got paper towel, tissue, anything basically that can absorb. I've got those standing by so I can get them really quickly. And I'm going to create the wash. And what I want to do is go back in and lift off the color just kind of soak it back up. I'm going to show you a couple different ways to do that. And it's never going to get it back pure white, but it will get it a little bit whiter. And it's a good way to kind of create clouds sort of off in the distance, kind of indistinct clouds. So the first thing I'll do is kind of blot that so it doesn't get out of hand. All this paint that got down here wouldn't matter for what we're doing. Then I'll go in, if I start with the tissue, generally the big puffy clouds are a little flatter on the bottom. So I keep it kind of flat, and then I sort of add some puffiness up there. They're also in perspective, in what's called atmospheric perspective, which means they're going to get smaller and begin to overlap as they go back in the distance. So I'm keeping it kind of flat. And when I get up here, they're larger. And if I do too much of it, I'm kind of in danger of doing that right now, then you lose any comparison. You don't have any dark blue sky left. Now if it was really important that these stay pure white, I would have masked those off. There's ways you can do that with it. You can actually make tape bend if you want to. So those look alright. You know, they're not real distinct. They get kind of fuzzier in the background. There's some blue in them, but that's okay. And that's the lifting off. And dry brush, it's a little bit of a misleading name because it's not totally dry, but the paper is dry and your paint is going to be pretty dry. So if you go back to how we had the brush and we did pulling up, you can do kind of that technique without doing the spattering first. It's going to get a little bit different texture. What I'll do is I'll put some paint on the brush and then I'll sort of blot it on a paper towel. It gets a fainter kind of look. If you want it darker, you can kind of manually hold it apart, or you can spend the money and get a fan brush. Fan brush is one that looks like that permanently. So what you're doing is getting that scratchy kind of look. You can do cross hatching. You can also do something called stippling, which is just using the end of the brush. We did some of that, remember, with pencils, and I told you it was a brush technique. You can make it very precise, or you can kind of just do this, get the blotches. So it's kind of an effect. It's a subtle effect for textures on top of other things. But any kind of way that you use the brush like this that's on a dry surface that gets that dry, scratchy look kind of falls into that category. Okay, so I know this has been a long video. Thanks for hanging in there. Go back and look at a few that needed some drying time. If you remember with glazes, you needed clean water, thin layers of paint. Now that they've dried, you just do the same thing in the other direction. So this drop of yellow, you don't want to scrub it. You want to get it on there and just leave it. Now the clean brush, I'll do the red. Oops. Leave a little space. Sorry about bumping the camera. Oops. And then blue. And what happens as that dries even more is that you get the secondary colors. So you've got yellow on top here, which makes the blues on top, I'm sorry, it's a stronger kind of blue-green. The yellow's on top here, so it's a yellow-green, or maybe I got that backwards. But you can kind of see the two different greens. You've got different oranges. You've got different violets where they meet in different ways. And so it kind of looks like these layers of clear plastic that you've put on. And you can keep doing that and build up one color and variations and do shading, or you can also just do like this and mix your colors, and it gets kind of a smooth version. And returning to Scrafito, and this was the scratching out color. They were in the same area. This we did before. On the one that's dried now, You have to have a good watercolor paper to take this because it's going to tear into the page. But you can kind of remove little bits there. If you need a really rough effect, you can scratch down to it. And it's actually going to kind of pull up the paper and make it a little bit 3D. So I don't use this one a whole lot, but it is there to use. But it does get a very rough look to it. And kind of backwards, you get dark lines here, you get light lines here. Stamping, stamping is just what it sounds like. Is you just take any object that can hold paint, you can make marks on the surface with. I actually wanted to try this because I've never done it. I wanted to see what would happen if you put rubbing alcohol on dry paint. My feeling is it won't do anything for a minute, but it may make a mark after a little while. So a lot of this kind of stuff you can sort of experiment with and see what it'll do. There's all kinds of ways. I wonder what the edge of this does if you rolled it. That's kind of cool. So there's different things you can do there for stamping. And looking back on the dried salt, the one that I did here just really didn't turn out well at all. It was, well, it's a little better now. You can kind of see maybe some areas where it starts to kind of form. To me, it kind of has an effect of snow. This one turned out better. I think the reason is my salt is old. It's been in the classroom a while, so I'm going to need to buy some new. So it's just like with the flavor leaves of salt, the effect of doing this. However, the plastic wrap turned out really well. This is the one I did the other day. This is the one I did here on the video. Now that it's dried, you can see that gets in a kind of a random effect. I'm not even quite sure what you would use that on, but it's a real nice abstract effect. And I believe, I'm looking down the list, I think that's everything on the list with the examples. So when you're finished, you will have this whole sheet. And when you take the tape off, be very careful when you take it off, because it will tend to rip. What I would suggest is, see how it ripped right there a little bit, is pull it over itself and kind of away from the paper and just do it slowly where your hand is right down next to it. If it starts to rip, you can stop, maybe take a little, if you have a X-Acto blade or something, and run next to it. You're not just pulling the whole tape like that. I just got really lucky. Usually if I do that, it's going to rip. But if you pull it kind of close, you're going to get a really good line there. So you'll want to remove all your tape and then go back and label all of these. So I've added a little extra to the labeling here. So as you're labeling, just go through and pause on these. That one's the same. Flat wash, no value change. The graded wash, dark to light. Some of the examples on here are not as good as the ones I just showed you. Wet and wet, mixing color. And you can label if you use different things for masking. Spattering and pulling up. There's the lifting color. Finally, dry brush. So that's what you'll want to do. And then take a good, clear picture of the whole thing like this. And that way when I can zoom in and go across and look at all those and see all those. And so what I'll grade on those is, did you get the technique correct and is it labeled? If you mess up, and that can happen because you're trying this for the first time, here's what I'd recommend. When you come to pick up this paper, pick up 2 sheets. And let's say if you're going down through here and the salt like mine just didn't work out, or you mess up on the rubbing alcohol, or whichever one, then on the second sheet, don't cut right out of the middle because you can use some of that sheet for a painting later on. But just cut one of these little squares out. You know that they're 3 inches by 3 5/8. Cut one of those out, tape it down, do another sample. When it dries, just put it right on there before you take your picture. If you can just lay it down there, you can tape it on, and that way you can do corrections as you go, and you still have a page of all your samples that you can refer to. Alright, so I think this is a record for my longest video yet, but we're going to work on this in class on Monday, the March 1st, and Tuesday, March 2nd, working on the techniques. And then we'll probably have a little thing on the 3rd because that will be a a distance day, so look on Canvas for I'll have an exercise that you can use these on and kind of apply them. And then I'll do another one. We'll start with some different assignments and projects that I'll lead you through with videos that apply these into some artworks. Okay? Have fun painting. Don't forget to get good, clear pictures. See you next video.